Muchas gracias por estar aquí con nosotros. Muchas gracias a Laura y al equipo técnico, a Marina. Y muchas gracias a Emilia Jamroziak, a quien conozco hace ya unos años. Nos conocimos en Dresden mientras estábamos ambos haciendo una estadía de trabajo en la Universidad de Dresden. Marina va a hacer una presentación más formal de ella, pero Emilia es una especialista internacional en historia del monacato medieval, sobre todo de los cistercienses, una referente de los estudios acerca de los cistercienses en la Edad Media. Y bueno, tiene el cargo más alto de un profesor en la Universidad de Leeds, en el departamento de historia, y hay que recordar que la Universidad de Leeds lleva adelante hace años, y en eso ha participado mucho Emilia, el Congreso Internacional sobre Historia Medieval más importante de Europa, y ella, ha sido directora de eso también, y ha sido directora del Centro de Estudios Medievales de Leeds durante mucho tiempo. Y su mentor, seguramente que ustedes lo conocen, quien la ha empujado mucho en su carrera ha sido Zygmunt Bauman, que fue el director del Departamento de Sociología de Leeds, que seguramente ustedes conocen a él. Así que, Emilia, muchas gracias por estar aquí, por tu generosidad. Sabemos que estás muy ocupada en quehaceres académicos y burocráticos de la Universidad Inglesa. Así que gracias por estar aquí, y espero que no sea la última ocasión. Marina.
Bueno. Well, Emilia, it's a real privilege for us to have you here at the Center of Hermeneutic Studies, and it's a privilege to me to introduce you. Emilia Jamroziak is a professor of medieval religious history of the University of Leeds in the United Kingdom. She's originally from Poland, and she studied at the Central European University in Budapest. She received her PhD from the University of Leeds. She held a Humboldt Fellowship at the Dresden University of Technology, and also a Marie Curie Horizon 2020 Fellowship at the University of Erfurt in Germany. Among her various areas of expertise, we may mention medieval religious history from the early 12th to the early 16th century, monasticism, frontiers and borders in medieval history, East Central Europe, and historiography. Emilia, we are delighted to have you back at the center. Emilia was here in Buenos Aires back in 2019 for our colloquium. Welcome, the floor is all yours, Emilia.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction, and thank you very much, Dr. Rabbi Goldman and Professor Ruta, for the invitation. It's a great honor for me and delight to be here, and I hope what I'll be talking will be interesting for you and may spark discussions, and for these of you who are not so familiar with medieval monasticism, hopefully it makes you think maybe about also other things, not just monasticism, through what I want to say about monasticism. I think I'll better now share my screen so you can see the slides. And my slides are here, share. Okay, and now from the beginning. Okay. Since there is this wonderful simultaneous translation, I'll try to speak very slowly and clearly. I have a habit of speaking very fast, but this time I will try to speak very slowly, so it's possible to sensibly translate that. So what I want to tell you this afternoon and this evening for me here is not the sort of traditional account of medieval European monasticism, that it started at some point 2nd, 3rd century of Common Era in North Africa and in the Middle East, and then moved 7th, 8th century to Northern Europe and spread all over Europe. And there were such and such formal development and religious order. These kind of linear narratives you can find in books, you can find on the web. This is not interesting, and it's also now very much questioned by historians to what extent really was linear development. Instead, I want to tell you what I think is the most important about understanding medieval monasticism as a religious and cultural phenomenon, and how, in a sense, my own research being positioned, but I'll try to keep it at kind of introductory level as well. So, first of all, I think it's important to remember that medieval European monasticism is one of many forms across different cultures and time. Monasticism isn't something just to do with medieval European culture and not just Middle Ages. So, I mean, one could design the slide in different ways. It's very, it's one selection, but one could find lots of different other images from different places. So here are a selection of some of example of other forms of monasticism. So we have 2 Buddhist monasteries, one from Bhutan and one from India. And here it's on my right, I suppose you also see it on your right, from Ethiopia. And here at the bottom is a very, very contemporary, oops, sorry, I don't mean that. Here, Tautra Monastery in Norway. That's a house of Cistercian Reformed nuns in a very northern Norway, near Arctic Circle. It's a beautiful, extremely modern architecture. So I think it's important to think about medieval European monasticism as manifestation in the sense of wider, across several different religions, idea and practice of monasticism. Having said that, of course, not all religions, and certainly not 2 other monotheistic religion, Judaism and Islam, they don't have monasticism in that way that Christianity and, for example, Buddhism has it. But there is other types of organization, sometimes compared with or aligned with monasticism, mainly religious foundations. In English, it's not really good word. A German term for it, Stiftung or plural Stiftungen, is probably better. Some years ago, there was a big project in Berlin at the Humboldt-Universität. And the result of it is this 4 volumes encyclopedia of religious foundations. It was published by De Gruyter. I think parts of it are open access, but I'm not entirely sure. These volumes are terribly expensive, unfortunately. But what they've done, they compare religious foundations between medieval Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. Of course, it's not monasticism, religious foundations, many of them, for example, to do with education, but also commemoration. Sort of starting from this idea that monasticism is a very, very broad cultural phenomenon going beyond and not only medieval, and not only European, and not only Christian. That was a citation that I found many years ago working on my PhD, which was a study of a very particular monastery in northern England at Riva, Cistercian house, I found this definition of relationship between monastic houses and lay people very appealing to understand what's really at the center of it. And Ilana Zilber is an Israeli sociologist. She works generally on gift giving. Her current work is nothing to do with Middle Ages anymore, but that book was her PhD, in which she compared a particular type of monasticism and Buddhism with medieval form of monasticism. And this quote here on the screen, I will read it so it can be also translated into Spanish. I find particularly useful to think with. Lay donation, in short, are not just a payment for monastic, secular or religious services. Neither are they, however, equivalent to a straightforward commitment to virtuoso, meaning it comes from me, monastic perfection ideals. A more adequate interpretation of donation, rather, is that they contribute to mediating between two otherwise polarized and even antagonistic sectors, between a religious elite exemplifying certain ideals and lay believers willing to acknowledge the same ideal but unable or unwilling to commit themselves to their fullest enactment. The gift, in this case at least, is perhaps total in Mau's sense of being simultaneously economic, religious, political, and so on. But it is also ideologically a highly pliant and multivocal phenomenon. So from perspective of how I research medieval monasticism, I find it particularly interesting, this the way that monastic communities relate to the outside world, to the lay world, and lay world relates to monasteries. It's very complex, and of course, in each specific case of time and place, the details might be different, and they will be often different. The conflict, cooperation, interests will be different, but at the center is one very, very strong idea that monks and nuns are people who are, in a sense, between worlds. They are these who can mediate between normal people on earth, lay people, who cannot commit themselves to the extremities of monastic life, to this very, very demanding life of rejection of everything that people normally want: wealth, family, power. But this special place gives monks and nuns access to the divine that they can then mediate on behalf of lay people. So it's useful to, in a sense, take one step further before I will tell you a bit more about nature of this intercession by medieval monks and nuns and what form it had, and how, as a historian, as a medievalist, I can see it. For example, through what kind of text or objects. But it's useful to think first about actually why, on the whole, what is kind of historical consensus, why people entered monasteries, why they took these decisions to lead a very, very extreme form of life. And any kind of, obviously, ordering of these reasons is artificial. With every single medieval person who became monk and nun, in most cases, we have no idea what really motivated them. Yeah, we have no sources, no information, but cumulatively, we can see types of motivations, and they can be divided into two groups. Of course, each individual, each man or woman who became monk or nun, they could have a combination of this reason or just one, and they don't exclude each other. So certainly for early Middle Ages, so period up to, let's say, early 11th century, we actually see quite a lot of practice in which people would enter monastery and it wasn't their decision, which is very typical for medieval period, sometimes also described as Carolingian. So we are talking about 8th, 9th, and 10th century, where people would be given as children, sometimes as young as 5, certainly pre-teens children, by their parents to a monastery. It's in a sense offering, kind of ultimate sacrifice, but at the same time, it's in many ways an investment. Of course, at this time period, so early Middle Ages in Europe, monasteries were really only aristocratic establishments. These children given to monastery would come from elites, and there were reasons. For one thing, of course, this is offering, and such a person, it's a sacrifice, and of course, such a child growing up and spending the rest of their life in a monastery would then, of course, pray for their family, which would bring them. It would be ultimately, of course, positive. But at the same time, it was a place to put unmarried daughters, aristocratic families, and often the younger sons who, for example, wouldn't be suitable for career in the church, for example, to become a bishop. And of course, these early medieval monasteries were very much controlled by aristocratic families, often by ruling families. They were private in a way. But of course, what is also very important in early Middle Ages, if you think about what survives in Europe of texts written really up to 11th century, great majority of it, and certainly 7th, 8th, 9th century, it's almost exclusively things written in monasteries. Before the emergence of universities in Europe in late 12th century, the monasteries are really the places of learning. They have schools and scriptoria where texts are copied. They have the schools because this child oblate, this children needs to be taught, but at the same time, they are also centers of learning and centers of memory, remembering and writing down about past and present. I will come back to this problem of monastery as a place of memory, because that's a very important characteristic of cultural, social, and religious function on monasteries throughout Middle Ages. And then, of course, one can think about internal decisions. This idea of child oblates, that really disappears. By 12th century, nobody's giving their children to a monastery as a kind of offering. And Cistercians, so the religious order, which I particularly researched, they actually forbade that. They wanted only people who not only be adults, but already will be literate, have some basic education, and actually often have life experience. In the later Middle Ages, the age at which people enter monastery varies for all sorts of reasons. You can also see what would be now considered teenagers, so 16, 17. But on the whole, if you have children in a monastery in the later Middle Ages, they are there only to be educated and then they leave. So, for example, in the later Middle Ages, many nunneries also run schools for girls who are not meant to stay there forever. Of course, fundamentally, men and women in the Middle Ages enter monasteries monastery to obtain salvation. And this is something with Reformed monasticism of 12th century, like Cistercian, became really central to who they are. So their role isn't just to pray for the sinful humanity, but their own individual salvation is very important. And of course, idea behind it is because monastic life means rejection of these sinful conditions of power, greed, sexuality, gluttony, everything. It's life meant to create a condition for better chances, in a way, in the afterlife. But monasteries also, beyond early Middle Ages, continue to be places of intellectual work. And it's also interesting, as with the emergence of universities, it is not just that the mendicants, Franciscan, Dominicans, Austin Friars, and so on, also actually traditional Benedictine, Cistercian, Carthusians very much as well. Intellectual work is important for them, and they also interact with universities. It's a big topic on their own. I won't go into this at the moment, but they continue to be important in a sense also with emergence of printing in the 15th century in Europe. Cistercians, for example, take enthusiastically to printing and establish even their own printing houses. And real boom, I mean, real explosion of the sizes of monastic libraries in Europe actually happens 15th, early 16th century because of printing. And access to university, what I mean is that you couldn't study in Middle Ages for free, unlike in present-day Argentina, where you can study for free, which is a great thing. In medieval Europe, you couldn't. You had to pay. So actually, becoming a monk, and that's interesting, in the later Middle Ages, where we have far more documentation, far more sources, it's possible to trace also cases where people clearly become monks, because of course only men could enter university, to be able to study. And for Cistercians, for example, in the later Middle Ages, certainly by 14th century, you couldn't really become an abbot if you didn't study, if you are not university educated. Carthusians in England, in 15th century, they actually require anybody who wants to become a Carthusian monk, they have to have a degree. Otherwise, no, we are not accepting you. Family tradition, what I mean is that you really see it, for example, with nunneries, which tends to be located more in cities, also for practical reasons. The idea that women, in a sense, they cannot action a lot of things. They are cloistered. Of course, they need to also have to mail intermediaries. But some of, for example, very well documented and very well studied female, for example, Clarissan or Dominican houses in cities in southern Germany, such as Nuremberg, you can trace many generations coming from the same family. What it means in practice, then you would have aunts and nieces and kind of family connections and tradition that, you know, from our family, we send our daughters to such and such house. And of course, it's different where you have already a relative there. So what does intercession mean? So what is really, for majority of lay people in medieval Europe, the most important thing about monasteries, that monks and nuns in some ways are professionals of prayers. They are these people who are in between the worlds, and they can, because they occupy this special position, their prayers really count. But it is not just abstract prayers. there are particular rituals and actions that are very much valued, and lay people give material gifts in return for these spiritual gifts. It's not buying, it's not commerce, it is gift relationship, because gift of course requires counter gift. So this is exchange in a way, and it all happens in space. I will explain that more in relation to second slide. It in many ways, if we look at medieval religiosity in a very broad sense, not just monks and nuns and members of the church, by ordinary people. Medieval religiosity, at least how it's seen through the sources very much, was very much a practice of doing things with things, touching, kissing, owning things, interacting with. This, for example, okay, sorry, I have a tendency to go on tangents. I stop myself because I could start another lecture, and that's not a good idea. Let's stick to this slide. So the way that lay people could benefit from the spiritual power of monastic prayers and power, literally spiritual power of the monastic spaces, comes in different ways. People who for example, came from families of benefactors of monasteries, so whose ancestors either founded a specific monastery or gave big gifts, later on smaller. It wasn't unusual. It's quite well documented, for example, in 12th century, later on as well. We could call it retirement. So particularly aristocratic men in later life, sometimes close to death, literally retire to a monastery. A particular kind of dramatic variation of it is to simply go to a monastery and die, very importantly, in the habit of a monk. So you are then on the deathbed, dying as a monk, even if you never were, because it's again seen very beneficial for the what happens to the soul in the afterlife. But sometimes these people spend long time in the monastery, sometimes several years in this sort of retirement, without actually becoming themselves professed monk or nun. Then burials, unlike it, let's say, developed in the 19th century European culture, the way it also is being manifested in Argentina, this sort of, and I remember, yes, seeing in Buenos Aires, these beautiful 19th century cemeteries, yeah, with the very impressive tombstone with names. The way that kind of individually remembering with a name, this is very much 19th century. In the in medieval culture, it's actually far less important that your name is inscribed, that you are remembered. Here is this beautiful tomb, and your family puts flowers and candles, whatnot. No, it's far more important actually where you are buried. Of course, if you're a very important person, you would have a tomb, and it's very clear whose tomb it is. But it's far more important, the most important thing, that you are buried in consecrated ground. This is the first thing. But second, not all the consecrated grounds equal. So in a space of monastery, location or any church matters. The closer you get to the high altar, the better. It's, of course, this is completely anachronistic way to describing it, but it's a bit like the high altar in the church, main altar, there is, it's a nuclear bomb. oh no, sorry, not bomb. It's a radiation, nuclear radiation out of it, and the closer you get to it, but it's somehow good nuclear radiation. It doesn't kill you; it's good for you. You get close to it, your soul benefits from it. So the closer you are buried to the high altar, your soul has better chances in the afterlife. In the next slide, I will show you some examples of other spaces in a monastery that were considered also powerful and good to be buried. But lay people could be also, their souls could benefit from their relationship with a monastery through objects. So donating objects would be very important, especially if their name was inscribed there, or there would be their image in it, as you were forever present there. And the idea is, of course, others seeing this image would pray for the soul of the person depicted. So this is kind of very much physical aspects of that intercession, linked to physical presence, both in life, but very much in death. You are kind of becoming, as a dead person buried in a monastery, lay dead person buried in a monastery, you are becoming almost like a permanent guest. Because, of course, hospitality is a very important aspect of monastic culture too. And the second column, the very important and very desirable thing was liturgical commemoration. So being, for example, remembered in yearly masses on the anniversary of death. This is something that was hugely important in late medieval culture, of course, not just in the monasteries, and it kind of is a big boom for it, so to say, to use slightly crude language. It's very much, of course, linked with the development of popularization of idea of purgatory, the concept of purgatory, and that particular type of intercession by the living on behalf of the dead can lessen the suffering, make suffering in a purgatory where not so horrible and shorter. But in the monastic tradition, going back to really early Middle Ages, to even 6th, 7th century, there's something called libri vitae in plural, liber vitae singular, so book of life, literally. What it is, it's literally a book in which names of mostly benefactors, sometimes people who are described as friends of monastic community, they are written down. And that book is placed then on the altar, and forever, not just when these people are alive, but forever, it's placed on the altar during the Mass. So again, the power of the liturgy literally kind of drips on that book. And they are also remembered, because a very important cultural role of monasteries was also remember people who were their benefactors, who were their friends, pray for them, but simply also remember their existence. And linked to it, of course, this idea of confraternities, so kind of associations that developed greatly in the later Middle Ages, and they, of course, existed in Catholicism beyond Middle Ages. It also a way to remembering and creating this, for example, yearly rituals that would be beneficial for departed members of confraternity. And a very good example of text that encompasses both this function of monastery as a place of memory, liturgy, but also idea that, in a sense, monastic community is something that transcends death. It never dies, it's always there, are the necrologia. And I have on this slide two examples. from one Cistercian, one Benedictine house. The one on the left, it's from a great project, kind of big international project called Fragmentarium. There's now, I think, also Argentinian sub-project or sort of section of that, cataloging all the fragments of medieval manuscripts in Argentinian libraries. So it's a really useful project. It takes place in a lot of countries and allowed to bring into fruitization, to attention, all sorts of fragments that were unknown, many of them in the bindings of later books. Okay, so, but what do you see on the left-hand side? This necrologia of Altzella Monastery, which is in Saxony, not far from Dresden. It's a Cistercian house. And this is typical necrology. So this is calendar, but calendar without a year. It's like a permanent calendar. And every monastery had them. So they're according to Roman calendar. And so you have month and date and names. In a sense, it doesn't matter which year these people died. And some such manuscripts were kept or were in a sense in use for centuries. So you see, if it's in manuscript form, you see handwritings from 13, 14, 15, sometimes up to 19th century, because in a sense, it doesn't matter in which year these people die. It normally means members of the monastic community, monks and nuns, but quite often also their benefactors and friends, so lay people, because this calendar means that you need to pray, you need to have a mass on the anniversary of these people's death. So it's kind of remind of obligation, but also relationship. And within monastic community itself, for example, for the Cistercian, at the end of daily meetings in the chapter house, they always prayed for all their departed brothers and sisters, and their dead abbots were buried under the floor of chapter house. So it's very symbolically the idea that in a sense, monastic community transcends death. It's both people who are present, but also these who at any point in the past were members of that community. And here on the right-hand side, there's an example from a Benedictine house from Bamberg. If you ever go to Bamberg, it's a really beautiful place to visit. It was secularized, closed down in the 19th century, but Bamberg is on a series of hills, and this monastery, Michelsberg, is on one of these hills. It's a very beautiful place, and there are vineyards around and so on. So here it's how edition looks like, and I put a link on the slide. If you Google it, you find it. It's open access. It's published by Monumenta Germaniae Historica, but it's open access. And of course, Fragmentarium with these. Sorry, I speak too fast. I'll slow down. These digitizations are also Fragmentarium are free, so you can access it later on at your leisure if you want. So you can see here there are names of people, and sometimes they are described if they are members of the community, if they were lay, sometimes relationship to somebody else. So I'm coming slowly to the end, but before I do that, I wanted to explain a little bit more about the sort of power of spaces in monastic spaces. It could be a lecture in itself, but one problem is, of course, if showing any photographs of contemporary or 19th century photographs of monastic buildings from Europe. It's how they look like is actually nothing to do how they look like in the Middle Ages. They're completely empty in comparison how they looked certainly in the later Middle Ages. They were full of what is described in English as furniture. So lots of side altars, various kinds of objects, lots of tombs of different kinds. They were very busy places. There were also a lot of partitions which disappeared, first of all, after the Council of Trento, but also later on, certainly Second Vatican also changed a lot of other things. So what I mean, here we have examples from Alcobaça. Some of you might have seen it. I've never been to Portugal, but it's very, for Cistercian houses, they are some of the best in Europe. In Alcobaça, it's also interesting because they have very good surviving liturgical manuscript collections, and there are at the moment running really good projects by Portuguese medievalists and art historians and specialists of liturgy, projects on memory, but also liturgy in Alcobaça. So if you Google it, you find information about this project. One is completed, one is still running. It's really, really interesting stuff. But here we have example of this sort of high-ranking burials, tombs which would be with highly decorated and, of course, highly individual. Many monasteries in Europe, of course, in the Middle Ages, like Alcobaça, were also places in which particular dynasties liked. It was family tradition, so subsequent generations would be buried there and commemorated, remembered. It would be very spectacular. And what is very kind of strange paradox of again, only aristocratic, sometimes or very often royal burials in the later Middle Ages is divided burials. It's actually, for a monastery, it's very desirable to have important lay people buried because it can mean further donations, important connections, good friends. And so kings quite often would be buried in several places. What it means, you embalm the body, take the brains out, and you bury internal organs in one place, sometimes heart in another, and body yet in another. Late medieval royal burials were incredibly, and funerals, incredibly elaborate processes. And here we have an example from Scotland. This is quite a well-known case, also because of its post-medieval history and importance for kind of Scottish national identity. So Melrose Abbey was founded in early 12th century by King David I of Scotland, and it was a place of royal burials, in particular heart burials, so just heart of King Robert the Bruce. And this casket was discovered during the excavations in 1920s in the chapter house. So these skeleton burials, where you see these are of abbots, that this casket with embalmed heart was found there. Another place which was also desirable to be buried in a monastery. Example here you see from Biebenhausen in Baden-Württemberg in southern Germany. This part of the monastery, this structure is 15th century. It's a cloister, Kreuzgang. It is the late medieval one were glazed in Northern Europe because it's cold. Yeah, earlier they tended to be open. So this is this galleries around the central open space of monastic enclosure, and on the floor here there are graves, and this is good to be buried, spiritually good place to be buried, because the monks or nuns, they walk over you, and it's good because it shows your humility, but also because these people are very pious, it's additionally good for your soul. So to finish off, I wanted to draw your attention to kind of final point. It might at first feel unrelated to you, but I wanted to leave you with thinking about history of monasticism is also a good example of thinking about how it's important who writes history of what, and the whole idea of writing history from within and from outside, how differently it's shaped if you write it from within or from outside. So in a sense, writing history was fundamental to culture of Christian monasticism from the beginning. In a sense, already in the deserts of Egypt and Syria and the Holy Land, where this 2nd, 3rd century monks and nuns lived, they were already, in a sense, writing history of what they are doing, and it was hugely influential, the vocabulary, the idea of desert, for the rest of history of Christian monasticism. But what I kept saying, in a sense, monasteries throughout Middle Ages were places of memory, where monks and nuns were writing history of their own institutions, but also what they knew about their world around. And but for monastic communities, also their own past is a kind of resource for present. It's often clearly used as a way to remember how we overcame difficulties, how often, of course, through supernatural means, through intervention of saints, various difficulties were resolved. But what happens, of course, in early modern period, and certainly by the time where Europe is split in the Protestant and Catholic world, by the time the so-called Ordensgeschichte, so the history of religious orders, become dominant, because ultimately form of religious orders, that what triumph, and it became the way that Christian Catholic monasticism function. And this model, and you might have heard about the Bollandists or Congregation of St. Maur, so Benedictine monks from 16th, 17th, in 18th century, writing and actually creating in many ways tools and methodologies of what became tools of history as a science. So, for example, diplomatics, how do you find information, how do you edit sources, how do you date documents? It all kind of really come into big clash and resolution in 19th century, where the idea of secular nation state, so the idea of writing history through nation state, becomes dominant in Europe. So then, of course, history of monasticism, of individual houses, but also entire orders, needs to be cut into. So suddenly we have French monastic houses, German monastic houses. A bit later on, we see very similar processes in late 19th, 20th century in Eastern Europe. It's a big topic in itself, but the way that history of monasticism becomes also part of national history. And then the final element worth reflecting on, of course, is that there's still certainly was in 20th century, and it is now history of monasticism written within by people who are themselves monks and nuns. But of course, but at the same time, lived monasticism isn't living museum. It is not playing to or pretending or acting out something from the past. is a living tradition, but that often meets processes of making heritage and processes of musealization. So, and certainly in Western Europe, very secularized realm, it's very interesting to observe now how various tensions around it, which is, I won't now go into details because I would now bore you for another couple of hours, but I just want to leave this idea, because it's maybe also something you observe yourself in some ways. It's also the processes that, for example, living institutions at the same time present their own past that isn't, in a sense, museum. It's quite a complex problem. And in countries like England or parts of Germany, which went through Protestant Reformation, and what you have in standing ruins, the interpretation of this ruins for wider public, it's also an interesting problem. So I wrote it through mechanical translations. I hope this, what I wrote here in Spanish, actually makes sense. And thank you very much for your attention. And I'm very, very grateful for the invitation. And thank you so much for translation. I hope I kept to my promise of not speaking too much, too fast most of the time. Thank you. And I hope, I'm looking forward to some questions and discussion.
Thank you, Emilia.
I will stop sharing my screen now.
I think
Muchas
Carolina
gracias,
has a question.
Emilia.
No. Perdón.
Era un aplauso.
Thank you very much.
Emilia, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I know that your specialization is not the history of theology of monasticism, but I have a question. What is the difference between in terms of theology between the different types of monasticisms in medieval time? For instance, your work is overall about Cistercians, no? But which is the difference between these Cistercians and Benedictians, other Carthusians, and other? Could you say something about this topic?
Oh gosh, I mean, this can be answered in so many ways. Yeah, what is the difference? I mean, if you're asking about theology, yes, and there are whole libraries of books on that topic, because on the whole, traditionally, I mean from let's say late 19th century, history of monasticism being written through this very kind of implicitly and sometimes explicitly progressivist lens. So you have development of forever better forms. Yeah, the idea that, I mean, that's how history of Europe been told up to now. I mean, now it starts to crumble and people try to find different way, also because we are clearly coming to the point where things are really not working. Yeah, and this idea of forever progress and development, it's clearly not working. But that was for so long projected back. So the idea was this sort of line that you have first these people in the desert who start monasticism, and then you have dominant Benedictine mode up to the point where orders, reformed monasticism comes in early 12th century. And then they are great, and they have so many new things, they are better, but then they are no longer good, they become corrupt. So they are superseded, comes mendicants, and mendicants are great, but then mendicants become again corrupt. So you have Carthusians, you have others, and then of course come Reformation, which is also often presented as a kind of inevitable because it becomes corrupt. And then of course you have Jesuits, and then you have all these 19th century congregations. So this is the kind of traditional model, and you can look at differences between Cistercian and mendicants. You can look at it in so many different ways. You can look at, sorry, I speak again too fast. You can look at organization, how the structures it develops. You can look at spirituality, because that clearly they have distinct modes of spirituality, very different. You can also look at certainly big difference between cloistered monks, so broadly Benedictine tradition, and mendicants, so being in the world. But the problem with this linearity actually ignores the fact that all these forms were much more simultaneous, and they were not heading towards some inevitable reformation. Part of the problem of this sort of inevitability of reformation is that idea of reform is very deeply ingrained in monastic culture. So they had the idea that it's very different thinking about time, meaning of time, than modern one, than modern secular world. Sorry, I talk too much, and you ask. Sorry, I better stop now, because sorry, I have a tendency to answer questions in too long way. Sorry, I better stop now. I could keep going, but sorry, it becomes another lecture.
I have a question for you and Danny Goldman. In the beginning of the monasticism, there is an influence of the relationship between the Hebrew experience, the Jewish experience, and the Christian experience. I want to say, if it was in the beginning of the monasticism in third or fourth, it was an influence of the Jewish communities or not? What do you think? For instance, in Africa, in Egypt. Yeah. Dani. Se fue Daniel Gol. No, ahí está.
Perdón, se puede preguntar en español, ¿eh?
Un minuto. ¿Ahí me escuchan?
Sí. ¿Se entendió, Daniel, la pregunta?
No la pude terminar de entender.
Sí, en los comienzos, si pensás que los comienzos del monasticismo cristiano, siglo III, digamos, en Egipto.
Sí, ahora ya está entonces, ok. El tema no pasa por el siglo III, siglo IV, pasa por el siglo I y siglo II. Toda la cuestión vinculada con Qumran, con los rollos del Mar Muerto, ¿sí? Está puesta en esa mirada. Pero es más, digamos, hay todo un debate que aparece en el Talmud, de uno de los grandes rabinos, Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai, que él se escapa con su hijo porque era perseguido, se escapa al desierto y se esconde durante 12 años en una caverna, ¿sí? Lo que cuenta el texto del Talmud es muy interesante porque relata algo así, como que él y su hijo estaban desnudos durante salían para rezar, se desnudaban y después entraban nuevamente en la caverna y solamente dejaban su cuerpo debajo de la arena y la cabeza por arriba. Es decir, la idea era que se dedicaban exclusivamente a las cuestiones, llamémoslas, intelectuales, ¿no? Del debate del texto bíblico. Y finalmente, después de 12 años, porque imaginan que ya Roma no los perseguía, vuelven a la actividad cotidiana, pero con una tensión muy fuerte, ¿sí? Entre la gente que vivía en el pueblo, en la ciudad donde él vivía, y ellos, porque de algún modo se habían acostumbrado a esta vida, llamémosle monástica, ¿no? Lo que algunos estudiosos del tema dicen que esto puede ser perfectamente comparable, ¿sí? Con el mito de la caverna de Platón, etcétera, etcétera, donde ahí se toma nuevamente esta idea. Pero en general, ¿sí? La vida monacal en la tradición judía, hasta, digamos, solamente yo diría siglo I, siglo II, estaba vista o se practicaba, después no se practicó más, ¿sí? Los únicos textos que prácticamente se conocen sobre cuestiones de vida monacal eran los textos de los rollos del Mar Muerto, ¿sí? Que eran un grupo que tenía sí, una visión bastante apocalíptica del mundo. Ellos llamaban, ¿sí? Los seres de la luz, o ¿sí? Frente a los seres de la oscuridad, que eran los que vivían sí, o tenían otro tipo de vida que no sea esta vida monástica, ¿no? Hasta ahí lo mío, ¿eh? Pero Emilia debe conocer el tema y lo conoce mucho mejor que yo.
No, definitely not. I do actually teach also medieval Jewish history, but mostly sort of high Middle Ages Ashkenazi history. No, the only thing I could add to this, Rabbi Goldman mentioned that, in a sense, I think Greek culture is, and in a sense, ancient Greek philosophical inheritance is also linkage. And I've noticed recently there is also literature now or research that tries to connect potential linkages between this very early Christian monasticism with Buddhist tradition, although of course Buddhist traditions are much older, that the Greek culture essentially is linkage. But the desert, I think the only thing I can add, desert is incredibly powerful image, and that's something that gets used and reused in monastic culture. And obviously in Northern Europe, desert, for example, could be a forest. And desert has a lot of symbolic community in a city, busy city, can also create desert. So there are also various types of spiritual practices that meant to create it within the enclosure. But that's, I better stop. I think there are other questions.
Josefina.
¿Puedo hablar en español? A pesar de que estoy contentísima porque entendí todo en inglés, pero no me animo a hablar.
Sí, claro.
Dos preguntas. Primero, que en realidad es la que más me interesaría. Cuando pusiste las motivaciones o por qué las personas entran al monasterio, una de las motivaciones era la salvación individual, la intercesión también. Pero me llama la atención que no pongas la experiencia religiosa, yo diría la experiencia de Dios, que me parece que en el fondo, de mi experiencia personal, es lo más fuerte, aunque hay muchas otras motivaciones. Esa es la primera pregunta. La segunda pregunta, que la hago desde la sorpresa casi de la maravilla de tu investigación, la claridad, y además que en medios seculares se hable así, la sorpresa viene de pensar, de preguntarme, ¿cuál es tu perspectiva? Porque en estos temas estamos acostumbrados a perspectivas mucho más secularistas, digamos, no de separación de Dios y el mundo, sino de exclusión, ¿no? Bueno, pero te agradezco porque me pareció, cuando dijiste que estabas terminando, yo miré el reloj, pensé que eran las 3:30 y eran las 4.
Thank you very much. Then it sounds like I talked for longer than I was meant to, but I'm glad it wasn't boring. Thank you very much for your comments and question. I think you raised a really important issue because it's also, in a sense, question about history of writing about monasticism and how, in a modern world, in a modern secular world, historians been rationalizing and what kind of questions they've been asking about foundation of the monasteries and why people joined them. And there are, I mean, if you look at 20th century, there are types of writing about history of monasticism that basically could totally exclude religion. And there are two reasons for it. There's one very much in Western Europe, published in English or in German. Unfortunately, I don't read French, so of Western European languages, I operate in German and in English. But I know there are such works in French as well. So you have a history of a monastery, essentially as a landowner, as an institution that controls territory. They have that much power, they get this. And religion is something marginal and accidental, and it's almost like a superficial layer. And that was particularly strong in the 60s and 70s. There's also a truly bizarre genre of historiography, again from 70s, although I've seen publications up to late 1990s that try to present Cistercians as a kind of proto-capitalist. Of course, what they do, they take kind of very crude take on Max Weber. And in Eastern Europe, for example, in Poland, particularly in the 50s, but already by the 60s it disappeared, similar studies in the communist times. You couldn't, it wasn't so good to study ecclesiastical history, but you can research the estate and property of a monastery. And I would say it's really properly late 1990s where I would say monastic history started to, historians working in a sort of secular world started to try to connect and not see monastery as a kind of collection of separate modes of functioning. Here we have economy. Here we have religion, sometimes interpreted as ideology, and here we have to do with power. And I think more and more now historians, even working in very secular mode, place religion, spirituality, and also even this individual choice when it's visible in the sources, why people enter monasteries, and how they lived their monastic life, much more seeing religion at the center of it and not trying to rationalize it in the contemporary mode, because that makes no sense. Because then we see everything so fragmented. And so I think your comment really goes to the center of, I think, what also now changes of how study of monasticism happened. And to finish my answer, I think what is very helpful in that a lot of research on monasticism now is much more interdisciplinary. So, for example, people who are art historians, who research liturgy, who research manuscript, who research history, work together. And far more, even historians are now aware of liturgy, and that really helps to see monasteries as fundamentally religious institution, rather than, you know, powerful organizations that own land, and that's it in terms of, you know, research questions.
Muchas gracias, Emilia. Gracias, Josefina, por las preguntas.
I believe that the question of the motivations and the evaluation of this motivation, Emilia, has to do with a question if we believe in the text of the monasticism tradition or not. In what sense? Because if you read the text of for instance, the Cistercians, the tradition, the Cistercians literature, one topic is always in the text. And these topics you can have a short statement about this topic is, we must know, we want to know if this man or this woman want to search God. If he want to search God, he has a good motivations to come in the monastery. That is something different to search the individual salvations. I believe that there is something more in this question and in the answer of this question, if these people search God or not. I mean, search a relationships, a personal relationship with God.
Yes, you are absolutely right. And because you come much more from a theology perspective, you are aware of it. And this is my weakness as a researcher in a way. I started as a historian and I've been learning more and more, for example, about liturgy. But my weakness is understanding of theology. So yes, and the search for God, true, and it's very, very present in the texts, and even things like, because that's well documented. For example, what Cistercians developed, the process of training these adults who want to become monks, the process of acculturation, how do you become a monk? And that's quite well documented through texts that were partly meant to be sermons, but also other type of didactic text for novices, which now people also try to study, for example, from perspective of emotions. So of course, the way that emotions and psychological states are described in this text is totally different than sort of modern vocabulary, but the search of God and difficulties of it, and this, for example, this sort of state of darkness or being lost, which is described in these texts. Also in Bernard of Clairvaux and other his contemporaries, this or even something almost like loss of faith as being normal for monk. Yes, absolutely. This is not the search of salvation. This is search of God, and it's not about afterlife. It is about life of being a monk or nun. You are absolutely right. And I haven't been talking about it because I suppose this is my weakest point as a researcher, because my interest being so much about these ideas about afterlife, and because my starting point being this relationship between lay people and monks, and the anxiety, in a sense, of lay people. Sorry, I probably talked too fast. Anxiety of lay people around their posthumous fate, but this is also something that is so well documented in the sources, and that's fundamentally always, I think, will remain a problem for researching anything in medieval culture. This extremely fragmentary, even for later Middle Ages, nature of the sources, that so much, in a sense, is missing. We often have glimpses, and we try to build something much bigger out of these glimpses, but it's yeah. Sorry, I better stop because now it sort of becomes slightly random thoughts.
I have a lot of questions. You spoke about pre-capitalism.
Yeah.
In a historical perspective, you believe that there is an influence of the monasticism experience, in the sense that to live in a community with experienced of others, not only experience, but also a way to thought about the society where community was more important than the individual perspective?
I think there are two different things here. This type of publication studies that try to see specifically Cistercians as a sort of proto-capitalist, that basically works that takes Max Weber, because Weber talks specifically about Cistercians as well. It's a search for trying to see rationality as particularly sort of Western and important feature, and projecting it back. And this trend of research in a more sophisticated way continues to exist. For example, the work studies on processes of decision making in religious orders. But this is so these studies from 60s and 70s that claim that Cistercians are almost proto-capitalists because they had such good organization of their estates. It's complete nonsense. I mean, it really doesn't make sense. By then, in the 60s and 70s of the 20th century, it made plenty of sense. And in this sort of very secular world you could then, in that sense, you could study medieval history legitimately. Yeah. So, but the idea of community and individual, I think that's also very interesting point where thinking about historiography. So why and how historians ask question about importance of community or the individual, and of course ultimately monastic community is far more important than individual, and in context of medieval monastic practice it's very explicit. So for example, Cistercians had a whole series of how to describe it, punishments and ways, because this daily meeting in a chapter house, abbot would give orders for the day, who and what does. Also, it was a time where, for example, punishments were administered, also physical, like beatings. I mean, and for transgression. And the idea is transgressions need to be punished because they are highly dangerous for the entirety of community. And every monastery, Cistercian monastery, had also a prison. And this is the reason, the idea is if one member of a community is kind of spiritually ill or cause harm to others, he needs to be isolated, because it can be damaging for the entirety of community. Definitely community is more important than individual. And if you look at, for example, of records of visitations, so these sort of yearly inspections by the Father Abbot from another monastery, one thing that is also always kind of interrogated and investigated is presence of factions or groups in a community, and cases, documented cases from that I know of, for example, from Cistercian houses in the 13th, 14th century, not 13th, 14 in the 15th century, of internal conflicts, sometimes even leading to murder, are linked to these sort of factions in the community, and that's really highly dangerous. There is clearly understanding that it has to function well together. Community is far more important than individual, without any doubt. And of course, it also goes back to the monastic vows of obedience. Yeah, one of the 3 vows is obedience. So yes, community far more important than individual, and this is of course interesting and important reflection for present day. Yeah? I mean, not. It sounds very crude, yeah. But I was teaching on campus today, and I was leaving, and I noticed on one of the buildings there was a poster put by university aimed at students saying, "Please consider wearing a mask in the busy places. Please consider," as it was individual choice, yeah, individual choice if you wish or not wish to infect others. I mean, it's just horrible, yeah. I mean, there's a situation where there is no community, it's just individual and his or her money. Sorry, but that's very off-color comment.
Pablo seguro tiene una pregunta y Carolina también. Hago de abogado del diablo acá. O un comentario.
There are some comments in the box, but I think they are mostly saying thank you, as far as I can understand.
Sí, agradecen, Emilia, se despidió Josefina, agradeciendo.
Thank you.
Y también María Esther.
I hope that the fact that I spoke not in Spanish and it was for translation, I hope it doesn't, I mean, I know that it's always a barrier in terms of discussion. It's harder to get discussion with the translation. And I hope what I was talking wasn't too obvious or basic for you, because I am aware that I think it's quite mixed audiences. I'm not only talking, for example, to historians. So I hope what I was talking wasn't also too basic.
Sin duda.
Carolina.
Sí, Carolina.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias. Hablo en castellano porque mi inglés es muy malo. Muchas gracias por la presentación, muy interesante. Yo quería pedirte si podés explayarte un poco más en algo que dijiste cuando iniciaste la presentación, que presentaste la idea de la mediación, digamos, de cómo la vida monacal tiene una posición de mediación, y los mismos monjes y monjas tienen como una posición de mediación. Quería pedirte si podés desarrollar o decir algo más en relación a esa idea de mediación.
Yes, intercession is really important in medieval Christianity, in a sense that lay people, in a sense, always needed. They had very, in a sense, limited access to the divine. They needed intermediaries. And that's manifested in all sorts of ways, not just looking at monasticism. So, for example, if you see the liturgy in medieval parish church, it's completely different. Medieval liturgy was completely different than post-Trento, or certainly very different than the 19th or 20th century. So lay people were completely passive, and they were screened off. So you had very limited view of the altar. And of course, it was happening in a language that liturgy was in a language most people did not understand. Eucharist wasn't given directly, but through a board. So the officiating priests would take the Eucharist themselves and kiss a wooden board, would be then passed on. So it was heavily mediated. In a sense, expectation of participation. So, for example, it was only in 1215, so relatively late, that Fourth Lateran Council mandated that every lay person should go to confession and take communion once a year before Easter. And even that was difficult to implement. And of course, so this is in kind of structural sense. But there's also another aspect of mediation. Saints are really important mediator to, in a sense, higher echelon of heavenly court. to God and Christ. Saints are really important intermediary as well. Huge amounts of what can be described as popular religious culture in medieval Europe involve saints as the kind of accessible figures, and intercession. So saints as this a source of miracles, help, practical help, and miracles were conceived and understood in medieval culture really broadly. It could be a miracle, could be something incredibly banal. Miracle in medieval culture doesn't need to be, let's say, that you are cured from a really dangerous disease. It could be literally your misplaced. This is an example from, I can't remember now, from canonization of what saint, I think it's 14th century. A woman misplaced cheese, which she bought, and then she found this cheese, and she attributed to intercession of a specific saint. So it could be something seemingly very banal. It's a miracle. And in terms of in monastic intercession, this is it does change within this sort of 1,000 years of monastic culture. I suppose understanding of it also changes. If we look at early Middle Ages and kind of essentially, I'm now making huge generalization, but if we think about kind of early medieval, very violent aristocratic culture, people who would fight other Christians a lot over land, power, property, and clearly being told that their lives are very sinful. And actually, you definitely need somebody who would intercede for your soul. And you cannot do it yourself. In a sense, you need somebody who leads this, who has this ritual purity, who leads this exceptional life. In later Middle Ages, again, I'm making sort of huge simplification, certainly development of the concept of purgatory had huge influence on all sorts of practices generated by church, but also by lay people themselves, that were understood very directly. There are very interesting images. I can think about the example. I don't want to Google it now, and because it will take too much time and put it through chat, but there's a from 15th century miscellaneous manuscript collection from Carthusian House in Northern England. There's an image showing somebody praying for a mass, and this mass happening. So, and there is a rope going from this person paying for a mass through the altar to heaven, and then down to souls in a purgatory. And the more the mass happens, this rope lifts the souls which are in a bucket suspended above the fire of purgatory. So if you give money for masses performed by, or prayers by Carthusian monks, your souls of your relatives in purgatory will suffer less this horrible fire. So this kind of and there's tons of other examples of things that people essentially could do. I mean, it says ask these professionals of prayer to do on their behalf for themselves, to set it up, for example, in wills before they die, but also they could do for their dead relatives. So it creates very strong bonds. I mean, there is a vast research it's been sort of very popular theme. Certainly, there's a lot of publication from 1990s specifically about this idea of bond in late medieval culture between living and the dead, the kind of obligation that they have, and the intercession of church and monks and nuns and other kind of organization within the church is very strong. Sorry, it was a very long answer to your question.
Bueno, muchas gracias.
There is a question in a chat, Emilia.
Yes, I wrote a question, Emilia, in the
Thank
chat.
you. Could you discuss the presence of anguish or Acadia in monastic medieval context? Oh, that's a good question. That's these of you who, I don't know, in a sense, composition of audience. So I don't know how many of you are medievalists, in a sense, people working directly in medieval studies. But there is, last maybe 5 years, maybe a bit longer, it's a very strong strand, the whole idea of history of emotions. That idea, I think it started more than 5 years ago. I suppose it started more with negative emotions, especially with anger and violence. And there is the idea that possibility that you can access emotional states of people in the past and not just kind of outer manifestations of that. And I noticed in the last couple of years there have been few more works specifically on emotions in monastic context, because in some ways it makes a lot of sense. There are texts that talk about emotions. I mean, what Carlos was asking me earlier about, because it operates on a couple of levels. There's definitely this strand in monastic culture that is about showing your emotion. And for example, gift of tears, very important in Cistercian culture, something very valuable. In prayers, that you are given this gift of being able to cry and empathize very, very deeply, especially with suffering of Christ. But anguish, the only examples, it's not an area I research myself. It's something I'm talking about now through the things that I read. Certainly anguish, I would say in particular, it's this, with this states, what Carlos was asking me earlier about, this sort of search of God and closeness to God, that, and there's definitely a lot of literature, a lot of medieval texts describing that, written both by men and women, and the fear of not being able to achieve it, or times when they don't have it. And slightly earlier, there definitely been types of research that try to psychologize it. So, for example, see it in context of depression, but that's been very much abandoned. This kind of approaches. These of you who are familiar or work yourself in medical history, that's very much frowned upon now, because that's, I always forget this term, when you try to put diagnosis on something back in the past, it doesn't make sense, because the way you describe both spiritual or emotional or psychological or physical suffering is very culturally specific, and you cannot in a sense translate it. So this recent literature much more tries not to try to say, oh, this is depression, but rather take it as emotion, and thinking about also in terms of community. So, sorry, it's a slightly roundabout answer, but yes, I would say all the examples that I know of anguish would be to do with this process of search for God, of closeness to God. Any other example that comes to my mind now of fear, for example, is many years ago I did a little project on monks as refugees. There's interesting, it's quite well documented in 15th century during the Hussite War. So Bohemia, Prague, the sort of heretical movement of Hussites, it kind of deteriorated into crusade and actually quite a nasty war. And for the Hussite, monasteries were target. And it's very well documented because many of these communities, it's basically present day Czech Republic, but also Austria, they had to run away. And some of them, there's surviving letters of these monks. Some of them then had to join other communities. And there are very interesting texts. Sometimes they made also notes in the books they took with themselves about their fear, also anguish about being separated. So wanting to stay as a community. They really did not want to be, for example, split and sent to different houses. And so this is another example which I can think about emotions. And very interestingly, it also, what they took with them when they were running away were books. Surely, of course, some liturgical chalices and things like that, but books, and that's also a very interesting, I think, interesting problem. Sorry, again, a very long answer.
Thank you, Emilia. I was writing another in the chat. I said, would liturgy be a healing factor?
Sorry, in the. Sorry, can you say it? Can you say it again?
Yes. What would be a healing factor in your opinion? A healing factor.
Healing factor.
This end. Yes.
Okay. I think that, yes, I think liturgy would be kind of go to, because again, this is slightly speculative, but if you think about if something really terrible happens, for example, violence in a monastic community, spilled blood, you need to go through particular rituals, liturgical rituals, to cleanse it. And I think, yes, I think that would make a lot of sense. Also, a good example would be, that's literary, but also reflective of something. In every community, in a sense, had its own foundation legend. In terms of using its own past as a resource, remembering origins is very important. Often it's a very dramatic story of something terrible happening and overcoming difficulties. And the foundation narrative of one house, also in northern England, Jerva, and they have a story that they were, it's fictional, but that's not important, that they were coming from mother house to establish new house. They got lost in a forest and they didn't know what to do. So they started, so Abbot decided, okay, in that case, we'll pray, we will say breviary. And of course, then a miracle happens, a little boy appears and tell them where to find way. Of course, this little boy is Christ and so on, yeah? So it's ritual tradition, and also, in a sense, supernatural. So creating story that that allows this group of people to restore order, both in terms of kind of ritual purity, but also order in terms what they think they are doing. And a past plays a very important role, remembering past as a resource, as recalling and remembering. And obviously also, no, sorry, I'll stop now.
Thank you, Emilia, for the answers.
I know that I have a clock, and I know that you are 4 hours earlier than me, but it's still the same length of time, yeah, regardless if you are in afternoon or evening. As you know, I'm very talkative about monastic things, but I also don't want to abuse your patience. We can also finish. I don't want to abuse your patience and keep you occupied.
Carlos?
No sé si hay alguna otra pregunta.
No sé,
si hay alguna otra pregunta o comentario. Está Tito Lorefice. Llegó. ¿Cómo andás, Tito?
Hola, hola. Hello, Emilia. How are you?
Hello,
Nice
very
to see
nice
you.
to see you.
Pablo, no sé.
Quisiera, aprovecho, Carlos, quisiera preguntarle a Emilia qué relación había en esas épocas entre las creencias paganas y estos milagros que ella explica que se tomaban milagros de esta manera, ¿no? Con cierta, podríamos decir, liviandad, entre comillas, ¿no?
Yes, that's a very interesting question. I teach one seminar just on that. It's a very interesting problem in medieval culture. Again, lots of literature, and in the course of the 20th century, interpretation of that changed a lot. So without any doubt, pre-Christian beliefs in Europe played a big role in the ideas of supernatural and magical in the Middle Ages. Of course, in the Middle Ages, it would not have been identified by people doing it, something pagan. They would not see it. They would place it, of course, in a Christian framework, but it clearly has big role. So idea of, for example, of sacred landscape, it's very, very strong. So some places in landscape being particularly powerful, and there clearly was a process of essentially Christianizing landscape, and certain and I know there is research done, for example, of how Christianizing landscape happened, for example, in Latin America, and I know that people also make comparisons, and it makes a lot of sense. A good example of something that clearly has, in a sense, pre-Christian roots, but it would have been never identified by people doing it, is a very popular motif in the later Middle Ages of figures, miraculous figures of Virgin Mary appearing on trees or being found by farm animals, for example, sheep. So what happens? It's a very common topos. There are stories like that from all over Europe. And it's primarily late medieval, 14th, 15th century. So the story is usually that shepherd, well, the animals keep going to one spot, or there's particularly beautiful grass there, or and they dig, and suddenly spring comes, and the shepherd finds statue of Virgin Mary, or statue is found on a tree. Animal keep going to that tree, and shepherd find the tree, and then a church is being built in a place of that tree. It clearly linked to ideas of particular places being powerful, trees. But of course, people doing it, they would never say, oh, we are worshipping tree. Yeah, here is Virgin Mary, her statue on a tree. And in that sense, the cult of Virgin Mary was a very good vehicle for being able to do almost anything with pre-existing important places and spots, because she could be anywhere. But there are tons of other examples. I stop now because I could keep going, because there were, just to finish off, there was also anxieties of church authorities, of especially so-called uneducated lay people, going too far in their practices. A very famous case is so-called Saint Guinefort. If you Google it, you find it. Quite a lot of secondary literature on that is in French. It's a case of dog-headed saint. It's a dog that was worshipped as a saint. It was suppressed. It's a complicated story, but it shows a very interesting mixture of different kind of practices that people themselves, this uneducated folks, is 12th century. They did not see it. They were doing anything wrong. They were Christian. So there's tons and tons of these influences. And the idea of, I suppose, power of space, it's much older and much more fundamental than Christianity in Europe. Again, I stop now.
Thank you very much.
Bueno, ahora sí podemos terminar, yo creo, Laura, o que sos la jefa acá.
Pablo nos manda su agradecimiento, nos avisaba hace un rato que está sin audio, sin micrófono, perdón, así que Emilia, te transmito los agradecimientos de Pablo, y agradecemos una vez más, Emilia, tu exposición, y por supuesto, como siempre, tu entusiasmo contagioso en todo lo que haces y transmitís, nos queda también como temple de esta tarde. Así que les agradecemos a todos y a todas las que nos acompañaron, y seguramente haremos otro encuentro. Ya haremos una serie, si tenés disponibilidad, Emilia, y ganas, ya coordinaremos para la próxima reunión.
Tengo una pregunta, Emilia. ¿A qué santo cisterciense le prendiste una vela para poder hablar despacio?
No sé si lo logró, no sé si lo logró, porque por el momento se aceleraba, pero bueno.
It was very good. It was very good. Thank you very much. Vielen Dank.
Thanks,
Muchas
Emilia.
gracias.
I think I shouldn't really tempt any Cistercian saint, because poor saint would have no chance.
Muy bien.
Bueno, ahora ya son las 10 en tu casa, así que te deseamos un buen descanso, ¿no? También. Las 10, tenemos 5 horas, ¿no?
9.
Ah, 4.
Ah,
4. Bueno.
9 o'clock.
Ok, bueno.
Muchas gracias. Chao.
Gracias.
Ah,
Adiós,
Muchas
adiós.
gracias.
Chao, chao.
Thank you. Bye bye.